Hi, everyone. Welcome to our training tonight. My name is Iris Wen. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and I am the FRC training coordinator. We are super excited to be partnering with Disability Rights California to learn more about this topic, respite services. First, we just wanted to briefly talk about what the FRC does here in San Mateo County. The FRC of San Mateo County serves families who have children with disabilities or special needs. We provide parent-to-parent support, information, referrals, help with navigating the systems, and trainings. I'll go ahead and put our contact information in the chat, and you can feel free to reach out to us. I also want to introduce our FRC team here, who is here with us tonight. We have Patricia Idrugo, who is our FRC supervisor, and she's over in our Spanish channel tonight. Thank you, Patricia. And we also have Tracy Nesbitt-Cretion, our new FRC coordinator. Next, I'll go over some general housekeeping items to make sure our training runs smoothly tonight. As mentioned earlier, we will be recording this training for any families and providers who are not able to make it tonight. So for this reason, we ask for your collaboration with the following guidelines. Please mute yourself when not speaking to avoid any background noise. We encourage you not to use your full names or disclose any personal information in the chat, just to protect your confidentiality. You can have your video on or off based on your preference. And last, we invite grace and generosity and your respect throughout this training tonight. As mentioned earlier, we are offering simultaneous interpretation in Spanish today. So if you haven't already, you can go ahead and select the language that you would like to listen to this presentation in the settings bar under the globe icon. And I'll go ahead and put the instructions in Spanish in the chat. We will be having a Q&A portion at the end of the training. We would like to keep it at the end rather than throughout the presentation, so we don't have to keep stopping the recording and so we can protect your family's privacy. We encourage you to ask questions by raising your hand using the reactions button in your settings bar, rather than using the chat to ask any questions or share any personal information. And after you ask a question, please be mindful of making some pauses to allow our interpreters enough time to translate both the question and the answer. Lastly, at the end of this training, we will be distributing a survey in English and in Spanish, one from the FRC and then one from DRC, to collect your feedback on how this training went. They will both be anonymous, and we encourage everyone to provide their honest feedback, as it will help us improve our trainings for you all. All right, and now I'll turn it over to Disability Rights California. Thank you.
Thank you, Iris, and welcome everyone. Thank you for attending the training this evening. We appreciate your time. We know that this, sorry, lost my train of thought. But let me go ahead and introduce our team. Emily Akuda, who is our presenter for today. We have Andrew Alton, who will be helping us managing the chat. We have Raymond Kwong, who will be behind the scenes along with me, making sure that everything is working smoothly as it regards to the materials and anything else. All of the links, materials that are referenced in tonight's training will be sent to Iris and Patricia, and they will then forward all that information to you. So for those who don't know about our agency, I'll just share a little bit about us. We are Disability Rights California, formerly known as Protection and Advocacy Incorporated. We are a nonprofit agency founded in 1978. We were federally mandated to provide legal services for people with disabilities. We work on issues such as special education, public benefits, regional center services, housing, employment, benefits, and so forth. We have offices in Sacramento, Los Angeles, Bay Area, and San Diego. Our smaller office is Fresno, Ontario, and Modesto. Your presenter tonight is Emily Ikuda. She is a staff attorney with the Disability Rights California Legal Advocacy Unit. She works for the Intellectual Developmental Disability Practice Group. She strives to help individuals with developmental disabilities access regional center services and avoid institutionalization. Prior to the agency, she worked as an associate attorney at Adam and Associate, a special ed law firm, and intern at the Los Angeles District Attorney's Office. She also received her Juris Doctorate from USC Gould School of Law. I will now turn it over to you, Emily. Thank you, everyone.
Good evening, everyone. My purpose of today, I am going to present to you the details about a very common service provided through the regional center system, and those are respite services. So if you're wondering, respite, what's that? How do I get it? How am I eligible? How does my child become eligible? I am going to answer these questions with this presentation, and also following the actual training portion, we'll also leave it open for question and answer. So that's your opportunity to pop in and ask any concerns, issues, questions you may have. I'll do my best to answer. If I am unable or need to go back and check, we also encourage you to reach out to our intake line, our helpline at Disability Rights California. We'll pop it in the chat as well. And I'll also add that at the end on one of the slides on my presentation. So without further ado, let's get into this. So let's start off with what exactly is respite and why does it exist? Well, I'll start off with the purpose. The point of respite, why it is provided by regional centers, is to give families a break, to give them some relief from providing direct care to a person, usually a child or some other family member who has a developmental disability. And by break, that includes taking a nap, doing chores, doing errands, hanging out with friends. It could be inside your house. You can actually take that break while you're still at home with that family member with a disability, as long as you get some relief from that caregiving. Or it can be taking place outside, going out, doing activities that you weren't able to do because of all of the caregiving you had to provide. So that is the purpose, the point of respite, giving you that, well, respite from having to provide that constant caregiving. All right, so this next slide is just kind of going over what kinds of respite there is. The most common is going to be in-home respite services. So how does that work? Well, usually the way it is arranged is regional center, they contract with an agency, which is some kind of service provider, to send out a respite worker to come to your home and provide that caregiving and supervision, thereby giving you that break. Now, that being said, that's how it typically goes. But as I explain later in this presentation, you can also have some flexibility in who that respite provider is, that respite worker who is providing that supervision. It could, in fact, be someone of your choice, someone that you choose, like a neighbor or a family friend or another family member, as long as it's not the caregiver, him or herself, providing that respite at the home. The idea being, like, you can't be both the respite provider and also the person getting a break from the caregiving. So just want to clarify that point. But that's how it typically works with in-home respite services. Another type is, and that's the second part, much less common, is out-of-home respite services. Now, usually, so for instance, it would be a kind of respite where it would actually be some licensed residential facility. It is, as the title states, out of the home, outside of the home. It includes non-medical care and supervision, and even if it's outside the home, that kind of respite sort of care still has to meet the consumer, in other words, that person with a disability, their planned or emergency needs. And heads up, I just realized If you see the word consumer in there sprinkled throughout the presentation, that just means the person who is the client of the regional center, getting services from the regional center. We use the word consumer because that's literally the word in the law that's used, the consumer. So I just want to clear up any confusion. Sometimes I'll even like interchangeably go from client to consumer. Just want to understand they're the same thing. So that is the breakdown of just what the types of respite exists. Now, that being said, I've gone over just what it is and the basics of why it exists, but how does one get respite? Or how do I get respite to help give me a break from that constant care and supervision I'm providing for the regional center consumer? Well, I'm going to go on in the following slides. Okay, so this is a breakdown of eligibility for respite services. Number one, consumer, the client of the regional center, lives with a, quote, family member. That's important. There's actually a specific definition to that, and I will go into later in the presentation, but lives with a family member. Number two, IPP team agrees that there is a need for respite. And by IPP team, that's basically everyone involved in that process where you determine what services is needed from the regional center. IPP team is going to include, of course, the actual consumer, even if it's a child, although if it's a minor child, oftentimes it's going to be the guardians, the parents, the mom and dad, who are going to be the key players in that IPP team meeting. And the others are going to be the regional center staff, the service coordinator, sometimes the supervisor of that service coordinator, and if necessary, the service providers, the actual people providing the respite, for example, may be within that IPP team. It can also include other people if you believe that they are important to have at the IPP. I've been in IPP teams, so as the advocate / attorney. So just letting you know that by IPP team, it does include the regional center, it does include you and your child, but it can also include other people. But as long as a team agrees that there is a need for respite, then that is what is that helps meet that eligibility to get respite services. Number three, so following that IPP team agreement, it is then written into the IPP individual program plan as in a goal or objective. So it's not enough that the team agrees that, oh yeah, we believe that you would benefit from respite, that you would help to get a break from the caregiving. It has to be written into the individual program plan. So there's the IPP team, the IPP meeting, and then there's the actual IPP document that lays out the agreement, the services, and puts it in there, a goal or objective where the respite would meet that goal and objective. The last one is just more or less confirming that this is a service where a person with a disability would and their family would need it. The consumer requires more care and supervision than a person of the same age who does not have a developmental disability. So as to this last point, this usually applies more for very, very young consumers, because in general, a young child is, even if they don't have a disability, are going to need quite a bit of care and supervision anyway. So that's sort of what they have in mind of like, okay, is this a person where they're already expected to get care and supervision just by their age? Well, then for that reason, you may not be as eligible, or at least for as many hours of respite, versus an adult child or a family member who's much older. And it's like, where you're like, oh, okay, this is a person where there is very much obviously a need that goes beyond a person their age who does not have a disability. This is a family that's going to need plenty of respite hour services to give them that break. So just a breakdown of the eligibility criteria to keep in mind as you are considering whether or not respite is in fact a service that you and your child needs. So, and sorry, I'm just giving a pause to make sure that the translation goes through effectively. So I'm just going to give a moment. Okay, so I mentioned in a previous slide that one of the requirements is that caregiving is provided by the consumer lives with a family member. So what is a, quote, family member? A family member of that client, that consumer, is someone who lives with that person with a developmental disability. So the vast majority of cases, that's going to be mom and dad, but it can also include other types of family members, other guardians, conservators, other individuals who are taking on that responsibility and living with that consumer. That family member is responsible for providing 24-hour care and supervision for that person with a developmental disability. And that family member is not a resident care facility or not a foster family home receiving funds from the regional center or any other public agency. So if you are in fact someone who works on behalf and through some kind of care facility, some group home or something like that, or it's a foster home type of situation, that makes it so you don't really meet that requirement of being a family member and thus eligible for respite services. I know that there's other information about how foster families who have children who are clients can get services from the regional center. That is information for another presentation, and we do have great resources and pubs that go into that, but I just want to highlight that point for purposes of getting across how that that may come up as an obstacle in getting respite. All right, so I've gone over what it is and what the criteria is to be eligible. So at what point, what's the process where the regional center actually authorizes it, actually pays up, actually funds it and has it so you get those respite services? Well, just to going down that process, the regional center identifies the respite service agency. I mentioned that before. Like that's usually how it goes. They have a contract with an agency that employs workers who provide respite care. They send them out to your home to supervise and watch your child. Again, that's an option. There are other options for choosing respite providers, but that's the typical case. So Regional Center identifies the respite service agency. The respite services must meet that client's objectives. I point that out and we'll clarify more. But for instance, like, I've seen clients where I need a respite provider who not only can care for my child, but is also bilingual, like knows Spanish and English, because how in the world am I going to know how well they're supervising my child or family member unless I can actually talk to them? So that's an example where it's like, okay, these are the specific qualifications that would be necessary out of a respite worker. And respite services are approved when the consumer and the regional center agrees that respite is appropriate for the consumer. And by consumer, I mean like the client getting the services. Although if it's a minor child, it's going to then that in case it would be their parents. So approved by the consumer, or if it's a minor consumer, their parents and the regional center, that respite is appropriate for them. Now, quick point in the bottom, the vendor agrees to provide respite services. Vendor is just another name for that agency or service provider. So it does come up where sometimes vendors are like, there have been circumstances where a vendor is like, I don't know if we have the staff who have the appropriate training or qualifications, so you may have to look elsewhere. So that's the point. That's why I'm adding that in. You do have to also get the actual service provider to also agree to be that provider of respite services. So how much respite can I get? And so this slide goes into that, but also just sort of some developments that have happened fairly recently. So there actually used to be a specific bar, a limit on the number of hours of respite services that you or your child could get. But that was but only up until 2018. So and before that, the limit was 90 hours on in-home respite per quarter. So that would be about 30 hours per month. That was it. That was the bar, the limit for in-home respite. For out-of-home respite, the limit was 21 days. So that was that. That was the amount permitted. And then at least up until 2018, and then the law changed. So it got this limit, this bar, got repealed in January 2018. So now there are no limits on respite hours. Instead, the determination it's based on the needs and preferences of the consumer, your child, and the family. And so that I just want to point that out because, and I think this is much less of an issue now, but some regional centers, they had like written policies, guidelines where they're like, oh, you can only get 90 hours per quarter of respite. And it's like, they are, because that was what the law allowed. But then the law changed, but then the policies didn't catch up. So it's like you had circumstances where service coordinators were like, oh, our policies only say 90 hours per quarter. And it's like, whoa. You do know that the law's changed, right? It's been repealed. You got to update those guidelines. I believe that at this point they have been updated, so that's less of a problem now. But I just want to give you, just want to emphasize the importance of knowing that there is no defined limit. That being said, just because there's no limit doesn't mean that you can. That doesn't also mean that you can go in, ask for, I don't know. I want 300 hours of respite per month, a very, very high number without explaining and clarifying why you need a certain number of hours. So if you are requesting hours above 90 hours per quarter of respite services, you need to be prepared to explain why. Because a regional center, if they believe that there is no need for that amount of respite you're asking for, they can still say no. So just because there's no bar on the number of respite hours doesn't mean that the regional center has to approve whatever number of hours you're asking for. So I do want to emphasize that point. And the purpose, I just want to clarify, because I mentioned it in the previous slide. I talked about how regional centers, they had these guidelines, and sometimes their guidelines weren't up to date with the changes in the law. I just wanted to go into more detail about that. So these guidelines, these policies, they actually have a name to them. They're called Purchase of Service Policies. We call them POS for short. In fact, you can see it on the slide, because of course everything has to be an acronym, but that is the name of their written guidelines or policies about how and in what way, circumstances, they approve services for your for you or your child's IPP. And these purchase of service policies, they have to be available. You can straight up ask for them. Hey, what is your written policy on respite? I mean, and it's also every regional center has a written policy on respite. So no, if they bring, so no worries about whether they have it in writing, they do. But there's other areas where regional centers will have certain services in writing, like what services to help employment options and skills. What about services to help increase how to learn certain skills, like cooking and cleaning and budgeting? Those are services where many regional centers have a written policy. That being said, the regional center is actually quite expansive about services that you can ask for. Just because it's not written in their purchase of service policies doesn't mean that you don't have a right to it or can't request it. But I'm talking about respite, and respite is in fact a service where I have seen every regional center have a written policy on. So just want to clarify that. But some regional centers policies, they do have caps on the number of hours. Not so much anymore. Like I said, at this point, 5 years out, they should have updated them by now. But just in case, if you get a service coordinator who's like, oh, we only our policies say we only approve this number of hours of respite, you can be like, no, law doesn't say that. Law that was repealed. I understand I do need to prove why I'm asking for this number of hours, but you can't use that argument of, oh, we don't approve any more than this number as an argument, as a reason to deny it automatically. The amount of respite, as I mentioned, has to be determined by a case-by-case basis. So you got to look at the regional center has to seriously consider your child's needs, their circumstances, your circumstances as the family member caregivers, and the number of hours you're asking for, and why or if you actually need that number of hours. So want to touch on this. So there are circumstances where, let's say you have a child or a family member where their care and supervision is actually there's a certain level of skill of training beyond that would require a qualified respite provider. So I do want to touch on that. Respite for consumers who have significant medical and or behavioral needs. So what I'm going to go over in the following slides are just like what training and skills could be required of a respite provider, a respite worker. Also going into incidental medical services, which is in fact something that a respite worker could be trained to provide, as long as it's incidental medical services. I'll explain what that is going on in this slide. And the regional center, if they conduct an assessment, the regional center will assess to determine what your child's needs and what kind of training or qualifications a respite provider would need to have. So an example is regional centers can provide what's called a nursing assessment. That can be an assessment to help determine, does your child or other person with a disability, do they need a respite worker who has some kind of nursing skills or is straight up a nurse they themselves? And so then they would have, if so, they would have to figure out, could that be something that could be arranged, could be funded or sought out. So that is the process usually if it's a circumstance where there needs to be some evaluation to really determine what the needs are and how those can be met in terms of respite. So I mentioned, oh, sorry, I'll just pause for a bit. So I mentioned in the previous slide, incidental medical services, that this could be an area of skill that a regional center worker, a regional center funded respite worker could be trained in. So what is that? What's a incidental medical service? So there's actually a specific list of them as defined in the Lanterman Act. They include colostomy and ileostomy, urinary catheter, so emptying and changing bags, often with involving urine, and gastrostomy, so feeding, hydration, adding medication based on doctor's orders. So that usually is where something like the G-tube feeding can come in. So this is with this specific list of incidental medical services, that respite worker must receive training to perform these services from a licensed healthcare professional. So the respite worker, even if they themselves are not a licensed nurse, they could still come to provide that care, that supervision, thus giving you a break. But they have to receive training to do these incidental medical services, and they have to receive that training from a licensed healthcare professional. So those are the general requirements if the services and care that your child needs is requires these type of involves these type of processes, the incidental medical services. So I just want to touch on the less less common but still applicable respite, the one provided out of home. So these out-of-home respite services, they're provided in, as it says, outside the home, in approved residential service provider type placements. But just like in-home respite, this type of respite is intermittent. It's like time by time, but regularly scheduled. And it involves non-medical care and supervision. So I really want to emphasize that non-medical care and supervision, with the exception of incidental medical services I covered in the previous slide. If you get as long as they meet that training requirement. It is, as with in-home respite, designed to give you and your family a break, allowing you, and examples that may come up would be if you're taking a vacation for like a week or more, where it's like, oh, I'm going to be out of the home entirely. Who's going to watch my child? So out of home respite may be an option. And even if they don't they're not expected to meet the care needs and supervision that are medical in nature, they still must meet the consumer's planned or emergency needs as written in their IPP plan. So just giving you an idea of what out-of-home respite entails. That being said, while you have a right to request respite, including out-of-home respite, and this is a challenge with all services, not just respite. Some regional centers will be like, oh, we don't actually have a provider right now, or we don't have a vendor who can do that. So just giving you a heads up, that has become a problem at times of regional centers struggling to find service providers, and they should still be on top of conducting that search. But it is something that has come up as an issue. Okay, so I've gone over the basics of respite, what it is, how you can get it. And so let's go into, well, okay, I guess I believe I do need respite, but how do I get the right respite provider? What's that process? What are my options? Well, this is going to cover that portion, as I said I would in the previous slides. Choosing a respite provider. So, as I mentioned before, how it usually works, regional centers identify a vendor being the service provider agency that hires respite workers to go out to your home and provide that respite service. So that's how it's the process. There's regional centers, they'll have like a list of service providers. You can even ask them straight up, like, can I have a list of all the agencies you're vendored who provide respite? You can ask for that information. And they should have it. And family member and also family members who provide that direct care to the consumer, usually mom and dad, they cannot provide the respite services. In other words, they cannot themselves be the respite workers themselves. So if you, let's say you're the mom or you're the dad, and you're the ones who are providing that constant care and supervision for your child who has a disability, well, in order for you to get a break, for you to get respite, then it would have to be someone else who is going to provide respite care so that for your child, so that you can get a break. So that is why you can't be the actual respite provider. You can't give yourself a break, but also be the one providing the care and supervision for your child. So I'm just using that example to highlight this specific requirement as to who you can choose to be the respite provider. That being said, you can choose to, let's say, have yourselves be the vendor. So have yourselves, in a sense, be the agency who yourself can hire that respite worker. So be like, okay, well, I want to be the one who chooses who provides that respite, even if it's not ourselves. So in a sense, we're the vendor. So you can actually play that role as long and make that request clear to the regional center. But like I said, the family, whoever you choose, if you do have someone in mind to provide that respite care, and it can be a family member, it could be another family member, as long as that family member is not providing direct care for the respite worker. So, again, using an example, it'd be like, well, I'm the mom, and I choose dad to be the respite provider. A lot of regional centers will typically be like, no, dads are usually also the caregiver. What else? It's like, well, an aunt or a grandparent. They come over and help out. They contribute, but they're not like the constant 24/7 caregiver. That could actually be. You can actually have them be the respite worker. In fact, I have actually seen parents have their other children who were adults who didn't have a disability, like an older brother or an older sister, be the respite worker. Actually have that person be the respite worker, watching and supervising their younger sibling, or as long their sibling with a disability, as long as they were 18 or over and had the training necessary, incidental medical services, then they could do it. And so those are circumstances where you do have that flexibility to choose who can provide that respite care. So this is just more technical stuff about, the process if you do want to choose your own a respite provider of your choice to watch your child. I just want to touch on it. Vouchers. A regional center may offer vouchers to family members that would allow them to obtain their own respite services. The vouchers must not exceed the cost of respite services that the regional center would provide. So being like there's a certain rate, a certain amount. That being said, if there are circumstances where, let's say, a respite provider you have in mind requires training or qualifications or needs, higher rates, that is something that you can you can make clear to the regional center of like, is this an exception? This is an exception where I can only get a respite provider who can provide services at a rate that is higher than what you have recorded. And therefore, now, whether the regional center will approve, that is not a guarantee, but you can still, but just a heads up, and I'll talk to you about it later in the presentation, you always have the right to appeal. Appeal being actively disagreeing with their decision and going to fair hearing process. So just letting you know, even if you ask for something or you request something you believe you or your child needs, regional center says no, you talk about it, debate it, still disagree, then you have that right to appeal, to disagree and to the regional center's decision and make your case for why their decision is wrong. But sorry to go off on that tangent about that. Just wanted to touch on it really quick. But other than that, just quick point on vouchers and I'll move on. So I just want to touch on this because it has come up at times from families who have reached out to DRC. Respite services as it applies to the Early Start program and how that actually may differ from respite services for your child if they are already eligible for full-on regional center services after a certain age. So before I go into early start respite, let me explain what early start. So for those of you who don't know, the Early Start program, that's basically California's version of the early intervention program. And these are services that are designed to specifically improve a child's development during the first years of life. What that means is that children who are eligible can be eligible for these types of services, these early intervention services, from basically birth to age 3. So that's the whole purpose, to really hone in on the earliest years, to really address any areas of delay or difficulty, to improve those crucial areas of development before the child turns 3. Early intervention services, as I said, they're provided through the California's Early Start program. Now that I've just explained the Early Start program, how does that apply to respite? Can you get respite? What if my child is, let's say your child is under 3 years old and they're eligible for Early Start. We don't know yet if they're going to be eligible for the full-on regional center services. Regional centers usually will do an assessment or make that determination either a little before or around age 3, but you can still, but for the time being, I'm getting Early Start. So could I get services like respite under Early Start? And that's what I'm going to touch on, and why that would differ. So respite for children in Early Start, in the Early Start program, is defined differently from the meaning of respite under the Lanterman Act. And by Lanterman Act, that is the law that created the whole regional center system. So that is the laws where all the regional centers and their services and programs, that is what created them, the Lanterman Act. But respite is defined differently under those set of laws versus respite in Early Start, which is completely separate from the regional center system, even though it's still the regional centers that are helping to arrange it. With Early Start, it's like regional centers working with the school district. But yeah, that's where, not surprisingly, we do get confusion, where it's like, wait, my child's an Early Start. Doesn't mean they're also clients of the regional center? Not necessarily. They still have to go through a determination by the time before age 3 of whether or not they qualify and will continue to receive regional center services. So I really wanted to clarify that point. Okay, so sorry about that long-winded tangent. The purpose of respite for infants and toddlers, those in the age from birth to 3 years old, the purpose of respite is to allow parents, the parents of those children, those infants and toddlers, to attend and participate in early intervention activities. So what that means is that, let's say early intervention programs require some involvement of the parents, of mom and dad, like to go to training, seminars, conferences. Other examples I've seen are like ABA, like behavior services, like ABA, where it's like, oh, we need you, the parents, there because you're going to be important in this process. So in those circumstances, these are activities where the parents are expected to attend, but well, if that's the case, who's going to watch their kids? Who's going to watch their their infant or toddler while they're going through these programs for the purposes of making sure their child gets early intervention? That is where the respite under Early Start comes in, but only for that particular purpose, only to permit the parents to go to these trainings and programs. And I'll go over more detail in the next slide. So just to go into more detail about that. Respite for children under age 3. So a child under age 3 in the Early Start program may still be eligible for respite services as defined under the Lanterman Act. Again, this is a very specific exception to what I said in the earlier slide. So you could get respite, just general respite, not just, the kind of respite so you can go to some program like seminar or conference. But these circumstances you will only apply if your child, your infant or toddler, has already been diagnosed or very much likely has a developmental disability that is going to be substantial, and that they will very well need more care that exceeds another child or baby their age, even as they get older. So a good example would be, a diagnosis of Down syndrome. That's a circumstance where even for a baby or a toddler under age 3, it's very likely, and the regional center will likely acknowledge that this is a child who's going to need a lot of care and supervision well beyond other children their age, even as they get older, even when they turn 3. So those are circumstances where regional center would be like, okay, we understand that this is a child who, due to their does have needs that exceed that of other infants and toddlers, which is big because infants and toddlers in general need a lot of supervision and care. But with a diagnosis, for example, Down syndrome or cerebral palsy, that can be a way to get not just respite for you to go to some program for early intervention, but also just to get a break generally. So just highlighting this potential exception or way you can get respite, even if your child is not yet found eligible for regional center services. Okay, so I've gone over the respite, and I've gone over how to get it, the process for getting it, what types of respite. But now we get to this point. How does it happen where respite gets terminated, where it gets ended? So I will expand on going on the later slides. So these are the circumstances where respite would be terminated, basically straight up ended. So examples are the respite jeopardizes your child's health or safety. Another would be you ask for it to end. You're like, you know what, I don't need respite services anymore. I can provide the care and supervision just fine without need of a break. So if you request it to end, it'll end. The consumer, in this case, you or your child, moves outside the service area. So this touches on the fact that regional centers are who they serve is based on their local area. So in case you don't know, there are 21 regional centers spread out of around the state of California. For San Mateo, I believe it is Golden Gate Regional Center, and other regional centers there's the ones in Los Angeles, ones down in the Inland Empire. So they are all spread out. And if you move, and which regional center is going to be providing services depends on where you live. And if you move out of that area, out of that catchment area into a different catchment area, it has to be that other regional center, that new regional center that's going to be covering that need. Only because, that previous regional center, their contract was with that local respite provider. If you're outside the catchment area, that may not be doable anymore. So that third point just really gets across the importance of the importance of coordination between regional centers if it happens where you have to move, so that there's no complication or gap in that process. I actually have, that being said, I actually have seen circumstances where a family continued to get respite, even though it was one that was paid for the previous regional center after they moved. But that was because the areas were still close together. So the regional center provider could still drive out and do that service. And also it's like a transition type situation of like, okay, this previous regional center, they're still going to pay and have that respite provider. In the meantime, we're going to go search for a suitable one that we're vendored with. Once that happens, we make that transition. That way you can go with our service provider, respite service provider, without any interruption or breaks with the respite. So just give you an example where of that kind of transfer from one to another and how respite worked out for that family. So that's the third process. Fourth, respite is no longer needed to meet the consumer's needs. And I mean, that's going to depend on you or your child's circumstances. One instance I've seen is like for an adult client, let's say, like whose family used to get, we're getting respite to help care for their adult child, but then that adult child, let's say they enrolled in community college or went to some kind of day program where they're gone most of the day. In that circumstance, that could be a situation where, oh, respite isn't really needed because you guys are getting a break while the person with a disability is out during the day. So just giving an example where it could arguably be a situation where respite is no longer needed for that consumer. And then the last one, the service agency itself, the actual provider, can no longer meet the consumer's needs. So again, that's a situation where if the provider is like, we don't believe we have staff with the training or qualifications to provide the respite, that could be a circumstance where respite is terminated. That being said, that should not be a reason for the regional center not to look for replacements or other options for respite services, but it is something that could be a possibility. Okay, and let's see. Actually, so before I go on, because this is kind of going into describing an important but related aspect to respite, I'm thinking it actually would be good to take a break right now. About a 5-minute break or so, give myself and my voice a break, give our fantastic interpreter a break, and we can pop in back around 7 o'clock or so and I can resume. So if that's okay with everyone, let's just take a quick respite from this presentation. Hi, everyone. I hope you had a lovely short little break. Give ourselves some reprieve. But now I'm going to resume, and this is where we left off. Generic resources. And I'm going to go over into what that is, why it's important, and how it applies to respite services. So, what are generic resources? A generic resource or generic agency, they tend to be used interchangeably, is any agency that receives public funds with a legal responsibility to serve all members of the general public. And so if you're thinking, okay, but what does that mean? So I put a list of common examples of generic resources, generic agencies, basically those other agencies that can provide a same or similar service like the regional center. And so those typically include Medi-Cal and Medicare, in-home supportive services, or IHSS for short, is an example. And in fact, I will touch on that and how that could be a generic resource argument relating to respite. Another one is Department of Rehabilitation, DOR. That's the agency that helps provide like the employment, vocational type supports, usually for those who are 16 or older. A big one is the school district. That's a generic resource. So, it's not a common response that families may get is, oh, my child would really benefit from speech therapy, regional center. responding with, well, is your child is they're under 18, right? They're getting special education through the school district. Well, the school district would handle that. They handle the things like speech therapy. So go bring that up with them, with the school district. And if it turns out that for whatever reason, school district cannot or will not help with that area with speech, and it's something that's relates to your child's disability, developmental disability, well, then you can come back to us. And that last part, coming back to us after you explore that option, that I hope that helps to highlight what is meant when regional centers say they are, quote, the payers of last resort. It's one of those sayings where you hear a lot, but you're wondering like how, what does that entail? And that's what is meant here, of like, you got to go through these generic resources if they can in fact provide a same or similar service. Only after going through those and confirming that they won't meet that need, then you can come back to us, us being the regional center, for that request. So it's also important to note that if you'd say you choose not to take advantage of a potential generic resource, that still is not a reason why the regional center should be paying for it. So for instance, if it's like, oh, my child is eligible for in-home supportive services from the county, but I'm not going to apply to that because I can just ask the regional center. That won't fly. Regional center will be like, look, if your child's eligible, you need to actively try to apply for it. Just choosing not to is not enough reason for you to come back to us to request that same or similar type service. So this giving you an idea of what entails with when you're asking for respite and how generic resources may possibly come into it. And honestly, generic resources and agencies, that's going to be a factor on all regional center services. So giving you that heads up, always to be prepared to respond to that potential point or pushback if you're asking for any service, not just for respite. Use of generic resources. So just expanding more on the whole generic resource, generic agency aspect, because it is so important to be prepared for it. So it's important to point out that even if you do have to go through this generic resource requirement, that doesn't let the regional center off the hook, although some regional centers may act like that. They'll be like, go to generic resources, go check that agency out, go apply to them, come back to us later. I'm like, oh, no, you're not off the hook, regional center. The regional center, they are defined as the targeted case management provider under the law. In other words, they should be really they're supposed to be coordinating, working with other agencies. So like, for example, the school district or the Department of Rehabilitation, actually actively coordinating with them. And this actually has become an issue with individuals who are getting older, starting to, think about options after high school, where it's like, wait, I've got these different agencies that could provide services like employment or secondary school or like college and such. But these different agencies could all do it. Who does what? How they're supposed to be coordinating with each other, making sure you get the services you need, and trying to avoid just kind of being bounced around from one agency to another. That I actually have a whole presentation just on transition services and this kind of area, but that's for another presentation. That's for another training. This is on just respite. But just want to point that out, the importance of the regional center's responsibility to coordinate and work with other agencies that could provide same or similar services. Another important point, actually, I'll pause for a moment. Another important point is that there should, even with that generic resource requirement, there should still be no gaps in services, basically an interruption in services that you or your child need. So let me give an example and how you can use that to get at least temporarily services you need from the regional center. Let's say you need, you and your child, you need these types of personal care services or something like respite, and you're in the process of applying to in-home supportive services agency, IHSS, with the county, but that process takes time. You got to go through that. You got to go through a whole interview. They send someone out to do the assessment. And there's no guarantee that you'll get the hours, or even if you do qualify, you get enough hours. So are you just going to have to wait and for that process to pan out with IHSS while you and your child are in desperate need of these types of supervision services? Well, you can, in that type of situation, you can go, and in fact, you should go to the regional center and straight up be like, I need this service. Me and my child needs this service urgently. And it's going to take a while before we can even confirm if a generic resource can actually provide it. So I want you, the regional center, to fund the gap, cover that gap so that there is no interruption in these necessary services. So that is definitely a circumstance where you should make that request to the regional center. Now, and the more detail of why that you are actively pursuing this generic resource, but again, it's an urgent area of need that needs to be met right away. The more you can, the better support you have to really convince and persuade the regional center to pay for it. Now, if you have a really stubborn regional center, they may still say no. But again, remember, you can appeal. You can file for fair hearing, and the benefit of that is fair hearings with regional center services are supposed to be a lot quicker, a lot faster to help resolve these disagreements ASAP. Just giving you a heads up, you always have that option. And finally, regional center, let's say you go to the regional center, you're like, I just need help with this area, this area of need for me and my child. And regional center is like, go generic resources, go check, go figure that out. And you're like, but I don't know who that is. Which generic resource do I actually reach out to? Who do I apply to? I'm lost here. Again, you can put that onus on the regional center of like, regional center, I want you to help me identify and pursue potential generic resources. And examples are like, applying to the Department of Rehabilitation. Their regional centers can actually help you not just identify it, but actually actively apply for it. So just giving you examples of like, okay, regional center, help me out here. I'm trying to exhaust generic resources and find services that meet my child's needs, but I need your help in figuring out what that is. And if it turns out they actually won't or cannot meet that need, or it's not really appropriate or the same, then I'm going to go back to you, the regional center, to actually meet that need. That being said, fortunately, respite, because respite services are a service that there's going to be a policy with every regional center. It should be more straightforward to determine that you actually meet the eligibility criteria. It comes up when there's like services where there are no written policies, where regional centers are like, well, go through generic resources, and that's like, so be prepared to really put pressure on the regional center to help you out there. So one generic resource I wanted to touch on, because it has come up as a potential obstacle to asking for respite service hours, is in-home supportive services, IHSS. These are services provided from the county. They are usually come in the form of like personal care services. They can include even more expansive services for those who have significant care needs, usually called protective supervision. So literally IHSS, protective supervision. That often comes up. I've seen it, like an example would be a family where the client, they're caring for has like Alzheimer's or dementia, where it's like, okay, this is clearly someone who needs 24/7 care. And that's where protective supervision would come in. In a child circumstance, an example would be, a child who has a severe genetic disorder where they deteriorate over time and they have significant care needs. Another example where protective supervision, IHSS protective supervision applied. So just a quick overview of IHSS in case you guys didn't know what that was. But IHSS is completely separate from Respite. It is paid for and funded not by the regional center, but through the county. So that is why it's called a generic resource, because it is in situations seen as a same or similar service that you'd have to go through first before going to the regional center. But I just wanted to go over, I have this slide to go over circumstances where actually they're not the same. And I have a child or a other family member who needs both IHSS and Respite. So just to go into to clarify that, as I said before, if you or your child are eligible for IHSS, you do have to, you can't choose not to apply as a reason to push the regional center to give Respite services. So apply for IHSS if eligible. That being said, if it takes time, and this is an area of care that you or your child needs, again, as with the previous slide, gap funding argument to the regional center. But if let's say the regional center is, but let's say you're in a circumstance, which I have in fact seen, of you arguing for, I need, circumstances have changed, or, it's just, I need more care. I need more breaks. I need more respite, so I can get some relief from the constant caregiving. And regional center may, let's say, for example, although I have seen regional centers respond, some of them, with this, oh, get more IHSS hours. Yeah, we see your child gets IHSS, they're eligible for IHSS. Go ask them for more hours. And it's like, okay, is that it? You have to go to the county? Not necessarily, because you can in fact be in a situation where you need and should get both, because IHSS and Respite, while they can cover a same or similar need, they are defined as different services. And I'm going to go over, and I just want to, I'll explain why. So IHSS, IHSS is, personal. The specific purpose is so the family gets the care, so the child gets the care that they need at home. And in fact, the IHSS provider, the person who's actively providing that care in home, is usually the family themselves, the mom or the dad. Sometimes, if necessary, you'll have to go with an IHSS worker, a separate person, but a lot of the times it's the parents themselves who are the IHSS worker. So it's like, the mom who's already providing 24/7 care, I am the IHSS worker. I am the one getting the funds from the county to provide IHSS hours for my child. That's IHSS. Where it can be, in fact, you yourself, the parent, being the provider. With Respite, the whole point of Respite is to give the provider, the care provider, a break. So remember how I said you can't be both the care provider, the 24/7 care provider, and also the respite worker, because you can't get a break if you're also providing respite care. That's where that distinction comes in. With Respite, you, the parent, typically the parent, mom or dad, you are getting the break. You can't be the respite worker and also benefit from respite. So that's where the difference comes in. And why that's important is, in let's say that aforementioned example, where it's like, you need more hours, your child needs more personal care hours, or you want more breaks, go to IHSS, get more IHSS hours. And then we've I've had a situation where I helped the parent, called the regional center back and explained, here's the thing, The mom is, in fact, she herself, the ones who asking for more respite hours. She's the IHSS worker. She's the person providing IHSS. You're asking her to ask for more IHSS hours when she's the IHSS worker. She's going to be working more hours. She's asking for a break. She's asking for time off from that constant caregiving. You're basically telling her to work more as the IHSS worker. So that's a circumstance where it's like, look, IHSS hours are not going to help her because she's the provider. She wants a break from the IHSS caregiving. That's why she needs the respite hours from you, regional center, to be paid for and to increase. So that is the example to really highlight where even IHSS as a generic resource does not in fact meet that respite care need and is in fact should be treated as a separate service, and why you could and should be eligible for both of them. So you don't have to, to conclude, you don't have to obtain or use IHSS before getting more respite care or respite hours. Okay, so so moving on from that, and I'm actually getting toward the end. I've gone over just what respite is and how it is and how it can be terminated and such. So this is just more of like a breakdown, some tips, advice for how you could go about asking for these respite hours to help you get a break from the regional center. So requesting respite from the regional center. As I mentioned before, if you're asking for a significant number of hours, or even if you're asking for any hours, really, still be prepared. Document your weekly schedule, including the time you dedicate to caring for your child or whoever the consumer is with a disability. And not just, like a breakdown of like, this is when I'm providing care during these hours and times of the day. And also, it also would help to put down times of the day where even if you're not providing care, you're still very busy. Like the other hours where I'm not providing care, I'm working, or I'm going to school, taking these classes, or, in some circumstances, I have these medical needs. When I'm not caring for my child, I'm at the doctor's office or at getting these therapy sessions. So even in the times where you're not caring for your child, you're not getting a break. You're still busy. So, those are also details that are important to add into your schedule when you're highlight it when you're explaining to the regional center why you need a number of respite hours. Also, make any list, or not any list, make a list of your child's behavioral needs or medical needs. So that, if there's like if in addition to the caregiving, there's a aspect of that care that really takes a lot out of you because your child has significant behavioral issues or needs, or has medical needs, especially with like the incidental medical needs like G-tube feeding, colostomy. Make a note of that. That's important to get across the importance of you getting more respite. And then once you've prepared all that information, make that schedule. Then make that clear at either an IPP meeting. Remember I said IPP team? Yeah, this is where the IPP meeting comes back in and why it's so important. So make that clear at either that meeting, or if, let's say, like, okay, I want to get that across without having to wait until we meet together, you can just send it in writing, a written request directly to the service coordinator. And that could be a letter. These days it's an email. So as long as you make it clear that this is the area of need, this is the number of respite and why you need that amount. Now that last part is that comes in when, after all of that, after having provided the supportive information and schedule and request, the regional center says no, or, well, we'll only approve this number of respite, but not the full number of hours you're asking for. So basically, like, so basically, like, no to that specific number of hours. If you're in that situation and you're like, no, but I need this number of hours of respite. I've explained to you why I need it. I've gone through the generic resources and why I've either exhausted them or they don't actually meet that need. After all of that, if you still get a denial from the regional center, remember, you always have that right to appeal. And to appeal, an important part of being able of going to the appeals process is getting what is called a written NOA, written notice of action. That is what NOA is referring to, a notice of action letter. Because again, everything's acronyms, but it is important that if you get a denial, that denial be written within what is called a notice of action letter, so that you can have that choice if you want to push and appeal that denial by the regional center. So I realized that this slide may actually is outdated now, because as we know, there was a pandemic that very much impacted the availability of services, a big one being respite. And so because of that, the regional centers, they were like, what do we do? These agencies, we can't send out these respite workers now because of risk of spreading COVID. And so they went up, so it was the state agency, DDS, which is short for the Department of Developmental Services, DDS. They were the ones where they had to step in and give some guidance. And DDS, they're the ones that funnel money to the regional centers. They're the ones that are actually expected to guide and monitor the regional centers. And with something like this pandemic, we're like, okay, DDS, we're going to need guidance here because this is a mess. What are we going to do? How are people going to get the respite, the breaks they need when we're afraid of spreading COVID or other or diseases like COVID? So DDS released these directives, these orders to the bosses, the executive directors of each regional center, explaining, okay, with COVID, here's what you do, or here's what we got, here's how we're going to go about this. So, an example would be like IPP meetings can be virtual. And I think that's actually carried over. So now it's like, okay, IPP meetings, we can make, really enhancing the use of like Zoom, Teams, other ways to have remote communications. And there was other directives that touched on respite. That being said, these directives did have expiration timelines. So these are I believe these are expired now, but I still wanted to bring it up because, technically COVID isn't over. We never know if another pandemic or something like the COVID-19 crisis could ever happen again. So I'm just giving you a breakdown of just what happened during the pandemic and how it could happen again, but letting you know that one outcome of the whole situation has been this enhanced use of these remote type of ways of communicating, of meeting. And in fact, not just with IPP meetings, even the hearing system. Like, remember how I said that if you have a disagreement with the regional center, you can actually appeal. So when you appeal, you actually take your case before a judge, or what they call themselves administrative law judge, because it's an admin type hearing. And before these processes, they're if you're thinking of like a big scary trial, it's not like that. It's way more informal. It literally would take place in a conference room at the regional center. The judge would be at one side, you and the regional center would be, across from each other presenting evidence. But now even that has been made virtual. So now if you do want to take that argument to hearing, like, okay, the regional center denied my request for this number of respite hours, I'm going to appeal. I'm going to disagree and file for fair hearing. You have the choice of doing it completely virtual. I actually went to fair hearing. That was completely virtual, literally, like right now, as in like the judge was popping up on a screen and we were making the case for why, this person needed this service. So just letting you know that as a result of the pandemic, even the fair hearing, even being able to appeal has been made where you have the option to go remote or virtual. And that has been helpful for families where it's really hard to arrange transportation or have someone to provide care, especially if the person with a disability has significant needs. So just letting you know, that's been the outcome with the whole COVID-19 situation. And with that being said, looks like I've reached the end of the presentation. So before I go on to question and answer, just wanting to give you a list of our resources through Disability Rights California. There's our website. Our website you can access in other languages as well. And also just wanting to put out advertised one of our really helpful publications specifically on regional center services and the Lanterman Act, the law that created the regional center. It's our manual, Rights Under the Lanterman Act, RULA for short. All the chapters are available online on our website in multiple languages. Literally everything I talked about in my presentation is in the our RULA. I think there's like a particular chapter broken down into questions that touch on each of these areas regarding respite, generic resources, everything else. And we've got tons more pubs. So just letting you know, we've got this great resource if you want to look it up yourself. Woo, okay. So this is the last slide. Just letting you know, that's my name, that's my title, there's my email address. But that being said, if you do have a specific question or concern, including relating to like regional center service access, we encourage you to please contact our intake line. Our intake staff are trained, who themselves know about the regional center system and also know how to refer you to resources that can help. And so just giving you a heads up that we do provide advocacy services. I myself have gone to hearings and IPP meetings as a representative, as an attorney, we are free of charge. That being said, we are a nonprofit. Our services and funding are limited. So there's only so much we can do and provide. So just giving you a heads up that while there's no guarantee of what kind of advocacy or level of representation we can provide, it is something that our services can cover, and it is something that's provided free of charge.